August 28, 1957. Filibuster. United States Senator James Strom Thurmond of South Carolina delivered the longest solo filibuster in American congressional history. Speaking for 24 hours and 18 minutes, Thurmond's aim was singular and explicit: to prevent the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1957. This legislative effort, though modest in scope compared to later civil rights measures, marked the first federal civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. Thurmond's obstructionist act would become a defining moment in congressional history, symbolizing the deep and institutional resistance to racial equality in mid-20th century America. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 sought to protect African American voting rights, establishing the Civil Rights Division within the Department of Justice and the United States Commission on Civil Rights. Although the bill had been weakened by amendments during its passage through Congress, it remained a critical federal acknowledgement of persistent racial disenfranchisement, particularly in the South. It was supported by the Eisenhower administration as a measured step toward enforcing constitutional protections. Thurmond, then a first-term senator, chose to stand apart from his party. Despite being a Democrat in the segregationist Southern bloc, he acted without coordinated support from fellow Southern senators, many of whom opted against filibustering the bill due to a gentleman's agreement with Senate leadership. Nevertheless, Thurmond proceeded alone, beginning his marathon speech at 8:54 p.m. on August 28 and concluding at 9:12 p.m. on August 29. In preparation for the filibuster, Thurmond had devised a physical strategy to delay the effects of fatigue. He soaked in a steam bath for hours prior to speaking in order to minimize his need to use the restroom. During his filibuster, he read from a variety of sources, including the Declaration of Independence, the United States Criminal Code, and George Washington's farewell address. He repeated portions of the South Carolina election laws and engaged in repetitive rhetoric to fill time. His speech, though filled with historical and legal references, was rooted in a determined opposition to racial integration and federal intervention in state election laws. Thurmond's filibuster did not succeed in blocking the bill. The Senate passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957 on August 29, one day after his filibuster ended. President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the bill into law on September 9, 1957. Although the law had limited immediate impact, with weak enforcement mechanisms and widespread evasion in the South, it represented a legislative turning point that laid the foundation for subsequent, stronger civil rights legislation in 1964 and 1965. The historical significance of Thurmond's filibuster lies not in its legislative effectiveness, but in its symbolism. It was a stark illustration of how segregationist policymakers used congressional procedures to resist racial equality. At the time, filibusters were an accepted tool of Senate procedure, frequently used to delay or block legislation. However, Thurmond's action stood out for its isolation. He acted alone, not as part of a unified Southern strategy. His determination reflected his broader political identity as a defiant opponent of federal civil rights interventions, a stance he maintained for decades. Thurmond's opposition to civil rights was consistent throughout his early political career. In 1948, he had run for president as the candidate of the States' Rights Democratic Party, known as the Dixiecrats, on a platform explicitly opposing racial integration. Over time, he remained a vocal defender of segregationist policies and states' rights arguments. His 1957 filibuster reinforced his national reputation as the most unyielding voice against civil rights reform. In later years, Thurmond's political position evolved. He switched to the Republican Party in 1964, partly in reaction to the Civil Rights Act of that year. By the 1980s and 90s, he had publicly hired African American staff members and voted for the extension of the Voting Rights Act. However, his 1957 filibuster remains an indelible part of his legacy, serving as a symbol of institutional resistance to civil rights within the federal government. The filibuster also influenced public discourse on Senate rules and the limits of legislative obstruction. Although filibusters remained a common tactic in later decades, Thurmond's 24-hour speech became the benchmark for extremity in Senate deliberations. It demonstrated the extent to which one legislator could delay democratic processes in the name of ideological opposition. Strom Thurmond's filibuster did not change the outcome of the Civil Rights Act of 1957, but it remains a defining moment of resistance within the broader struggle for civil rights in the United States. It highlighted both the obstacles faced by reformers and the extremes to which opponents would go to preserve segregation and racial inequality. As such, it stands as a historical marker of the Senate's role in shaping or stalling social progress. For enthusiasts of historical ephemera, visit history-collectors.com to find collectibles that might complement your collection. You can own a piece of history.